One of the most challenging aspects of the science of paleontology is trying to figure out what an extinct organism would have looked like when it was alive. Paleoart is a particularly crucial part of the science, with reconstructions of long-dead creatures allowing researchers to effectively communicate their findings to a larger audience. Because of this, it's important to try and make informed decisions about the life appearance of the animals involved, despite this very often being quite a challenge, due to a lack of information about the colors, external soft tissues, and more often than not having entire parts of the skeleton missing. But there's one dinosaur that is better known than all others in terms of its life appearance. Whereas all sorts of debates still surround animals such as T-Rex and Spinosaurus, a small ceratopsian, an older relative of the famous Triceratops, is known from an absolutely unbelievable fossil that's revealed all sorts about the coloration and soft tissue of this little dinosaur. I'm talking about Psittacosaurus, a ceratopsian dinosaur that lived during the early Cretaceous period and is currently represented by 12 different species and hundreds of fossils. These fossils have been uncovered in Mongolia, where the original type species was found, as well as China, Russia, and possibly even Thailand. Psittacosaurus was a basal ceratopsian and was still capable of bipedal locomotion, unlike later forms. Additionally, most species lacked the famous large frills and horns of Triceratops and its closer relatives, although species such as Psittacosaurus sibricus, named in 2010, do possess small horns above the eyes and the beginnings of a more elongated frill structure. Additionally, all Psittacosaurus species have long, flared-out jugal bones, forming horns in their cheek regions, and these horns are particularly prominent in Psittacosaurus sibricus. Because of the huge number of fossils and species known of this dinosaur, we already have a pretty good idea of its overall body and skull shape, plus some amazing insight into the degrees of variation between species, something you rarely ever get in dinosaurs. But there's one fossil that goes even further beyond in terms of preserved anatomical details. This is SMF R 4970, the specimen number given by the Senckenberg Natural History Museum in Germany, where it's now kept, to a truly astonishing Psittacosaurus fossil from China. The exact species of Psittacosaurus it belongs to is still not named at the moment, but this specimen shows an almost complete skeleton that's been compressed, displaying the underside and parts of the right side of the body. The bones are pretty much all there, but even more exciting is the presence of bristle-like structures along the tail, as well as preserved skin across much of the body. Now, the history of this specimen is a pretty interesting one. Rumors of this fossil's existence first began to circulate in the late 1990s, when apparently some photos of the amazing specimen were discreetly shown to a few people at a meeting of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. Then the images made their way onto the internet back in the summer of 2001. When these unauthorized photos of the bristles along the tail were shared around and began to spark a great deal of discussion about this particular specimen and its implications for dinosaur evolution, articles began to be published in the scientific journals Nature and Science soon after these photos leaked, and this led to a lot of speculation about where this fossil came from. In 2002, a short communication was then published, providing a preliminary description of the Psittacosaurus specimen and explaining its journey so far. It turns out that this fossil had almost certainly been illegally exported from Liaoning province in China, where it was found and then made its way to Arizona, where it was put up for sale in a fossil fair. After this, it then made its way to Europe with a German fossil dealer who sent it to a fossil shop in Trieste, in Italy, for cleaning. The owner of that shop then sent it to the Natural History Museum of Milan so that it could be studied by paleontologists, who confirmed that it was a real specimen despite doubts that it may have been a forgery. Apparently, while it was in Milan, paleontologists tried to organize a joint study of the fossil with researchers from China, and even attempted to have the specimen returned to its country of origin. But for whatever reason, these attempts fell through, and the Psittacosaurus ended up being sent back to the fossil shop in Trieste. Following its return, the owner of the shop gave the fossil back to the German dealer. Then, in early December of 2001, it was announced that the Senckenberg Natural History Museum in Frankfurt had bought the specimen from the dealer for a total of about $200,000. This understandably provoked all sorts of controversy and discussion, considering that the fossil had almost certainly been smuggled out of China. But since the purchase by the Senckenberg Museum, that's where this Psittacosaurus has stayed, and that's where I saw it in May of 2023. Since the museum acquired the fossil, there have been a few publications on the specimen, all of them greatly adding to our knowledge of the anatomy and life appearance of this dinosaur. Although it was at first considered by some to potentially be a fake, these claims were only based on those initial photos, and since then, paleontologists have confirmed it's definitely real. In fact, parts of the specimen were prepared at the Senckenberg Museum and revealed even more sections of exceptional soft tissue preservation that had been concealed underneath sediment, proving without a doubt that it was real. Additionally, the bristles on the tail were confirmed to indeed belong to the animal, and they were not plant remains, which some people had suggested. After that initial short communication published in 2002, in which the soft tissue preservation was briefly described and photos of the specimen were figured, the next major publication on the Psittacosaurus specimen was in 2010. This 2010 paper provided a highly detailed description of the scale shapes and distribution across the body, as well as some interpretations of what color this dinosaur would have been in life. Additionally, the cause of death of this individual was discussed, since a fracture in the right arm was identified, along with some signs of crushing and stripping of bone that are attributable to a bite from another animal. Somewhat surprisingly, the authors suggested the small-bodied heterodontosaurid dinosaur, Tianyalong, as a potential candidate that may have caused these injuries, since it was thought at the time to have coexisted with this particular Psittacosaurus and may have been able to inflict such bites. However, Tianyalong has since been found to come from a much earlier point in time, during the Jurassic period, so this particular dinosaur cannot have been the aggressor. Still, something seems to have bitten this individual, showing that poor little Psittacosaurus was likely an important source of food for the dinosaurs it lived alongside. In terms of the soft tissue preservation examined by this 2010 paper, the paleontologists identified 3 different types of scales: round, pebble-like scales, large plate-like scales, and smaller polygonal ones referred to as tubercles. Looking at the distribution of these scale types across the body, they were able to show that cryptic patterns of lighter and darker scales would have been present during life, due to the associations between the plate-like scales and the tubercles. This paper was also able to show that Psittacosaurus had a type of camouflage called countershading, an absolutely incredible thing to be able to find in a fossil that's over 120 million years old. Countershading is a fairly common color scheme seen in a lot of modern animals, especially marine ones, where the underside of the animal is a lighter color and the back is a darker one. This sort of coloration helps to counteract the natural gradient across the body caused by sunlight shining down on the top surface of an animal, making it harder for potential predators or prey to pick up on visual cues, giving away the shape of the animal. As it's such an effective type of camouflage, we see it crop up in all kinds of different organisms. And so it's no surprise that some dinosaurs would have been countershaded too. The Psittacosaurus specimen clearly shows scales with darker preserved pigment along the top surface and lighter ones beneath, and this pattern is especially clear at the base of the tail in the specimen. This research was built upon even more in 2016 when another paper was published, taking a closer look at the countershading in Psittacosaurus and making some amazing discoveries about the lifestyle of this dinosaur. Based on studies of modern terrestrial animals with countershading, the authors of this paper were able to show what sort of environment Psittacosaurus lived in, and also produced the most accurate reconstruction of a dinosaur's life appearance that has ever been made. It turns out that by looking at the extent of countershading in an animal, it's possible to quite accurately predict whether it is an inhabitant of an open habitat, such as plains, or a closed one, such as in a forest. In open environments where there's more direct sunlight, there is generally a very sharp dark to light transition high up on the sides of the body, whereas in closed habitats, the transition is smoother and occurs lower down on the body. Well, by creating a life size, completely gray model of this Psittacosaurus specimen in life and analyzing how it was illuminated in an open and closed setting. The researchers were able to show where the two different predicted boundaries between dark and lighter coloration should be on the animal. And as it turns out, based on where the lighter and darker pigmented scales occur across the body, this Psittacosaurus very nicely matches what was predicted for a closed habitat setting. So Psittacosaurus was most likely a denizen of forests, using its countershading to avoid the eyes of predators under a thick canopy. At least this particular Psittacosaurus species was, considering the amount of variation among other species, it's best not to make general sweeping statements for all members of the genus. This research also examined the exact coloration of different regions of the body too, resulting in another life-size model of this specimen created by the incredibly talented paleoartist Bob Nichols. The fossil preserves some amazing details of patterns in different areas, with some dark stripes and branching patterns on the legs and spots in other places. The upper forelimbs show clusters of raised and heavily pigmented scales, and the jugal horns and face of the animal are also very dark and pigmented. Examining the patches of darker pigmentation under an electron scanning microscope, the paleontologists managed to identify the presence of fossilized melanosomes in this material. Melanosomes are organelles situated within the cells of an animal that make and store melanin, a light-absorbing pigment that determines the color of skin. Melanosomes have been identified in fossils before, most famously in the feathers of some theropod dinosaurs, allowing for the reconstruction of potential color schemes. Well, the discovery of these organelles in this Psittacosaurus specimen proved that the color-determining parts of the scales had indeed been preserved, and so the patterns of darker scales across the body are genuine representations of the coloration and patterns this animal would have possessed in life. The overall color scheme of this Psittacosaurus would have been in the range of very dark browns to lighter browns and into amber and yellowy shades where the pigmentation became lighter. The stunning model of the specimen created by Bob Nichols captures all of these colors and patterns beautifully, using all of the evidence from the fossil and resulting in a truly remarkable life-size recreation. Everything was incorporated into this model. The different sizes of scales, such as larger scales on the knees and elbows, the dark pigmentation of the face, horns, and cloaca, and all of the visible subtle patterning around the limbs and neck. Those fantastic bristles on the tail are of course included too, and given a very nice yellowish color consistent with the rest of the dinosaur. So it's fairly safe to say that this Psittacosaurus model, and all the subsequent paleoart based on it, represents the most accurate reconstruction of a dinosaur ever, with SMF R 4970. Providing so much detail into the specifics of what almost every inch of the dinosaur looked like in life, something we are incredibly fortunate to be able to see. Another particular point of interest with this fossil is the highly pigmented region around the cloaca, the single opening in dinosaurs and most other tetrapods, used for excretion and reproduction. After publishing the paper in 2016, the paleontologists took an even closer look at this part of the fossil, and this actually then led to another study later being published by some of the same authors in 2021, the famous Dinosaur Butthole paper, to put it bluntly, that received a lot of media attention when it was announced, as you can probably imagine. This study went into extraordinary detail, describing the anatomy of this more than 120 million year old dinosaur's cloacal opening, something that I don't think many people would ever have dreamed of being possible. And of course, when I went to see this specimen in person, I just had to say a few words about such a remarkable instance of fossil preservation. Well, I truly hope all the passersby at the museum who were watching me give that little presentation there thoroughly enjoyed it. Anyway, in the cloaca paper, the paleontologists explained that the exact anatomy of the cloacal region had actually been incorrectly interpreted in their 2016 paper, and in fact even more detail could be seen and a much more accurate reconstruction could be made. As I pointed out on the actual specimen, it's possible to see the paired lateral lips and the dorsal lobe, which would have surrounded the actual vent of the cloacal opening. Now, the precise shape of the vent itself is unclear, as the lips and lobe obscure it on the fossil. However, the paleontologists use a technique known as extant phylogenetic bracketing to determine the two most likely shapes it could have been. Extant phylogenetic bracketing basically just means looking at living examples of animals that fall on either side of the extinct evolutionary branch being investigated. So, in the case of a non-bird dinosaur such as Psittacosaurus, this would involve looking at birds, which are themselves living theropod dinosaurs, and crocodilians, which are the closest living relatives of dinosaurs that aren't birds. So, Psittacosaurus would either have had a rounded opening, as in birds, or a slit-shaped opening like is seen in crocodilians. But keep watching for an answer to this dilemma that was published later. Another interesting aspect of the cloacal anatomy is the heavily pigmented scales of the lateral cloacal lips, which are between 3 to 6 millimeters wide and would have appeared very dark in life. This led the paleontologists to suggest that the cloacal lips may have had a visual signaling function in life, possibly making the individual look more attractive to the opposite sex. This is something only seen today in some species of birds, so it might, therefore, suggest that this feature first evolved all the way back in non-avian dinosaurs. The lips are also in the same locations as musk glands found in modern crocodilians, which produce a strong-smelling and fat-rich material when the animals engage in social displaying behavior. So, the paleontologists hypothesized that perhaps Psittacosaurus and maybe other dinosaurs had such glands too, producing distinctive scents when interacting with other members of their species. Bob Nichols again produced some fantastic paleord of such an interaction between Psittacosaurus individuals for this publication, showing a fascinating bit of inferred prehistoric behavior gained from this spectacular fossil. I should also mention another 2016 paper that was published on specimen SMF R 4970, in which the bristles along the top surface of the tail were investigated in more detail, utilizing a technique called laser-stimulated fluorescence imaging in order to make the bristles easier to see and geochemically analyze. The paleontologists showed that the filaments were actually all arranged in distinct bundles, which they show in this figure with the different colors representing the clusters of bristles. They also found that the bristles were probably very rigid structures that were cornified in life, meaning they had a horny outer coating that actually helped to preserve them in the fossil. The big question, though, is whether or not the bristles actually represent feathers in this dinosaur. Considering that Psittacosaurus is an ornithischian, one of the major grouping of dinosaurs, the other being the saurischians, which include birds and their relatives, it would be quite significant if they were derived from feathers, as it would be more evidence for feathers possibly being an ancestral feature for all dinosaurs. Based on the structure and geochemistry of the bristles, it seems they are probably homologous with bird feathers in the way that they develop from separate populations of cells in the skin. However, the paleontologists are hesitant to call them true feathers, since they are structurally very different, and it's still unclear if they develop from a follicle, which all true feathers do. The authors also note some very interesting similarities between the Psittacosaurus bristles and some display features seen in modern birds, such as the spine on the head of the horned screamer, the crown of the Congo peafowl, and the bristles of wild turkeys' beards. These structures in modern birds actually have a separate developmental origin from true feathers, and so it might be that this is the case in Psittacosaurus too, meaning the tail bristles cannot really be considered feathers. Another paper I must mention is a publication from 2022 that again uses laser-stimulated fluorescence to analyze in more detail all the integument types across the body of SMF R 4970. Amazingly, this study managed to find an answer to the mystery of the cloacal vent shape, something I know you're all very excited to hear about. Thanks to the laser-stimulated fluorescence, the convergence between the two cloacal lips was able to be seen even more clearly, allowing the researchers to identify the shape of the opening as having been longitudinally elongated. So, Psittacosaurus most likely had a crocodilian-like slit-shaped vent, not a round bird-like one. And with that, one of the greatest paleontological mysteries of our time was solved. Of course, the cloaca was not the only focus of this paper, and it also describes the full detailed complexity of the scale patterns and distribution across the entire visible body. publishing even more amazing photos of the specimen under laser-stimulated fluorescence and making some comparisons to the few other known skin impressions of ceratopsian dinosaurs. And as if all of these revelations from the fossil weren't enough, June of 2022 also saw the publication of a paper revealing what the belly button of this dinosaur would have looked like. The authors explain how an umbilical scar is actually still seen in egg-laying species, an equivalent structure to the belly button of animals that give live birth, such as humans, and it forms around the time of hatching after membranes within the egg detach from the organism. Well, SMF R 4970 really is the gift that keeps on giving, because laser-stimulated fluorescence has revealed the presence of paired scales running down the midline along the underside of its abdomen, consistent with the anatomy of umbilical scars in living reptiles and birds. Interestingly, since this Psittacosaurus specimen was likely almost sexually mature at the time of its death, this seems to indicate that the umbilical scar would have remained visible on the dinosaur throughout its life, unlike most reptiles and birds, which lose them in their first few days or weeks after hatching. However, a few living species do sometimes retain them into adulthood, but it is a very variable, species-specific feature, and the position of the scar can also sometimes vary between sexes in some reptiles. Taking this into consideration, then, it may be that not all non-avian dinosaurs retain their umbilical scars, but it seems that Psittacosaurus did, which is just an absolutely amazing thing to be able to discover. So here we have a life-size model of this specimen itself. This isn't the one made by Bob Nichols, but it follows the same sort of color scheme, showing the countershading with the darker colors and patterns on the top surface, and then a lighter underside. And then here you can see what those bristles would have looked like in life, potentially acting as a display feature. And at the other end, you can also see the distinct jugal horns projecting out from the sides of the skull, giving this amazing little dinosaur a very distinctive look. So then, Psittacosaurus has been quite thoroughly reconstructed thanks to this amazing fossil. And even parts of the dinosaur you would unnecessarily think could be reconstructed, such as the cloaca, have been. We are so very lucky to have this fossil and to be able to tell so much about this one dinosaur from it, and if only we had fossils like this. For some of the dinosaurs that always encourage a lot of controversy whenever they reconstructed, but obviously the chances of this fossil being preserved like this would have been astonishingly low, and I am just thankful we have it at all. And I am also very thankful that I was able to see the real thing for myself. It was absolutely unforgettable. It would also be nice if it hadn't been illegally taken out of China, though, and I'm not sure if there are plans to actually have it sent back at some point. We'll have to see what happens there. I really hope you've enjoyed learning about the most accurately reconstructed dinosaur ever, and let me know in the comments what dinosaur you wish could have a fossil like this found. Personally, I wouldn't mind some settlement to the Spinosaurus saga, as unlikely as that is. Anyway, thank you for watching, and a big thank you to our Patreon supporters, especially our dinosaur tier supporters.